Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rising. We have an amazing show for you, especially because Rachel Bovard is back in the house. Great to have you again, Rachel.
Great to be here. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. So guest lineup today, we got Ryan Grimm on. There's some critical primaries for progressives he's going to take a look at. Nobody better to break down those races. We've got great friend of the show, Kyle Kulinski, on. He's going to talk about MSNBC's new Never Trump heavy lineup. We also have some new polling out of Gallup. Their head of polling is going to be here to break it down on how Americans are feeling about school reopenings. But we wanted to start with the state of play with the economic negotiations, or the lack thereof, in terms of state of play on economic negotiations. Basically, this is according to Playbook and other reporters who've been covering this closely. The two sides haven't actually agreed on any of the major pieces here. Those pieces being state and local aid, those pieces, of course, being the unemployment benefits. I guess that's not fair. The one piece that everyone seems to agree on is the direct stimulus checks. There's questions about, expanding SNAP. There's questions on school funding, all of this. There were negotiations yesterday. Essentially, McConnell's been sidelined. Trump's been sidelined. This is Meadows, Mnuchin, Pelosi, and Schumer, who are, sort of sequestering themselves and trying to break down and come to some sort of a deal. The Democrats essentially, and I think kind of rightfully so, think that the Republicans are ultimately going to cave, because you had unemployment benefits lapse on Friday. You have millions of Americans who are depending on this payments. Democrats have passed a bill, right? Wasn't everything I would want it to be. I'm sure it wasn't everything you would want it to be. I think they've been very unclear about what their priorities are in this negotiation, but they can accurately say, look, we did a thing. We passed our thing. You all need to get your act together. And so this, according to Politico Playbook this morning, Pelosi yesterday on a call with Democrats said the two sides are not together on an amount for education funding. State and local cash is still a zero, but Republicans will come their way, but they don't know it yet. So that's kind of that confidence of thinking Republicans are ultimately going to cave here. SNAP is not where we need. She said Dems and Republicans are not moving on unemployment benefits. Election money is a big fight for us, and noted that they are going back and forth on USPS money. So she is essentially betting that ultimately the Republicans are going to come their way. I think it's a pretty smart bet at this point.
Yeah, she also said yesterday she's refusing to negotiate on the unemployment insurance amount as well, which I think, in fairness to Republicans, they actually have a couple of proposals out there, right? The debate isn't over whether UI should happen. It's how much and for how long.
Right. Seems
to be the issue there. And so I think, you're seeing at least three proposals now come out of Senate Republicans. One they voted on last Friday. So I think that's at issue. Again, we're up against a ticking clock. Congress does this to itself all the time and acts like, it's an incentive for them to do something, but it's not, because we're, going to be almost a week out from all of these benefits expiring, and people are suffering because of it. So I do think hopefully we'll have some agreement by the end of the week. But again, we don't know what's actually on the table. We're getting word from these guys, but the debate and is not happening in a transparent way.
Right. And it seems that, so the two negotiators on the White House side, Mnuchin seems to want to actually get some kind of deal with the Democrats and is more willing to kind of bend on the key priorities. Meadows, who's always been more of like a Tea Party hardliner, seems to want to move more in the direction we reported yesterday based on the Washington Post, that there's some movement or some desire to basically say, forget Congress, we're just going to do what we can with executive orders, which would be incredibly limited. Meadows seems sort of more willing to throw up his hands. Maybe that's a good cop, bad cop kind of positioning. But at this point, it doesn't matter, because, as you said, look, ticking clock, it expired on Friday. And it's like, don't worry, guys, take your time. We're all doing fine here. It's outrageous that it came to this point where you had to let those unemployment benefits lapse. And they're still debating about, different proposals for how we may get this done, as if it's absolutely killing them that working class people may get a few bucks extra than they were getting when they were working. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, who, by the way, new polling this morning shows him in a very tight re-election race, could be important as we watch him negotiate and maneuver on these packages. He's out with an idea about how to deal with the unemployment benefits. Let's take it. Listen to him.
So I think you can come up with technology to reimburse people at up to 100%, not more. At the state level, the $324, I believe it is close to that, per week is 50%. The goal of state unemployment benefits is to replace 50% of wages up to a certain level. What we've done here is we've far exceeded that. We're 150%, And I don't mind federal supplements continuing. As a matter of fact, I want them to, but the ceiling should be your actual wages. And I'll be introducing an amendment tomorrow to do that. And give the states another 30 or 45 days to come up with that technology, but we've got to get there.
Yeah, and that's one of the issues. If you're going to do wage replacement directly, it's very complicated for states to be able to implement. So the reason that we ended up with the $600 flat payment to start with was because that would be the easiest thing for states to be able to deal with. So that has always been the issue is, okay, you may want to transition to having it be some percentage of wages, but that's complicated to get to, and he doesn't really lay out there sort of a transition plan. Do you keep it the $600? Do you knock it down to the $200 that some Republicans have been floated? And also, by the way, a lot of the hardline sort of anti-spending Republicans have objected even to the $200 plus up on unemployment benefits. So what percent of the GOP caucus would even go along with this?
You know, it's interesting to your point, Congress has wrapped itself around the axle of UI and all of the attendant problems with that. And I think that's a really good point because we don't have the state infrastructure to be able to support this kind of thing. You know, we've locked ourselves into this track and we're on it now. But I think it's worth pointing out that the state capacity is low. Yeah. Right. And it should, and I think Senator Graham is right, it should play into whatever proposal goes into effect because as a point you made yesterday, it could take months for the states to get their act together to actually get this stuff out the door. So it matters. But I think to your other point about where the Republican Party is on this, you know, I do think at the end of the day, the majority of Republicans are going to come over on UI. I don't think anyone, give them the benefit of the doubt that I don't think people, want these breadlines. They don't want people unassisted in this case. But this is not the exclusive issue that we're dealing with, right? The bill is much larger than this, and a lot of the debate I think is going to be on where the rest of that money goes. You know, you've seen. Is it going to go to the payroll tax cut? Is Schumer going to get his way? Are we going to lift the cap on the SALT tax? So all of these issues are playing into it at once. I don't think it's quite fair to put it all on Republicans to say, well, they just oppose the UI piece. Some of them do.
Yeah, well, they oppose other pieces as well.
Right.
They oppose the state and local funding. There's questions about school funding. This is far from the only dispute, for sure. And there's another proposal that you actually pointed out to me from Mitt Romney about a different way to approach the unemployment benefits. Senator Thune saying that a number of Republican senators are warming up to this idea of extending federal plus up state unemployment benefits, $500 a week in August, then cut it back to $400 in September, $300 in October. What we have seen from the data, Rachel, is that the two programs that have done the most to float individual human beings and the economy as a whole were the direct stimulus payments and the federal unemployment benefits, which is why it's such a critical piece. You got something like 30 million Americans who are relying on these payments, who have been using them to avoid eviction, avoid foreclosure, be able to stay up on their bills. And so when you start cutting it back in significant chunks, that's going to be a major hit for people, but it's also going to be a major hit for the economy. So just talk to me about what you heard from the Hill yesterday about this particular proposal from Romney, where Republican senators are, and if you think that Democrats would go along with it, because it seems to me they're drawing a pretty hard line on $600.
They are, but I do think from everything I heard yesterday, the Romney proposal I think is most interesting to Republicans and ones that I think were initially opposed to just a straight extension because it's scaled a little bit and it's somewhat time limited. I think it's reflecting the impulse among some Republicans to say, look, at some point, the economy has to start picking itself up again. At some point, we have to incentivize it to do so. Not necessarily through UI, but I think that that's where they're coming from. And, the Romney proposal, I think, meets that concern where it's at because it's scaled and it's time limited. But to your point, the economy is not coming back this year. And so the actions Congress takes, I think, have to reflect that reality. I think there's a little bit of latent optimism within the GOP that somehow we were going to see a recovery.
Right.
And I respect that, right? You always want your legislation to reflect what's on the ground, but that's not the case this time.
Yeah.
So we are seeing,
Look, I wish they were right.
Right. We're going to have to be in this position for a little bit longer. And I think the GOP worries a little bit about the fact that there are Democrats, I think, that want to remake labor economics in this crisis.
Yeah, I'm one of those.
Right, which is a legitimate thing to want to do. But I think some Republicans are like, look, let's let's not do that when businesses are fighting for their lives. Let's get through this crisis and then have that discussion. So I think there's a little bit of that tension too.
I wish that there were more Democrats who actually were thinking that way. I mean, to me, the people who have been completely organized and gotten their way from the beginning, we haven't even talked about the corporate liability shield, which is like the one red line that Mitch McConnell put down. Like, we have to have the corporate liability shield, make sure businesses can't get sued, was the only thing that he really put in there. And the president talked about that too as one of his red lines, along with the payroll tax cut, whether that's going to come through or not. And look, I mean, I'm the first to criticize the Democrats on all of this, who have been unclear about their own priorities. And all of these people in Congress ultimately were complicit in setting up the structure that we have. I think you put it well that they've gotten wrapped around the axle of unemployment benefits, because the whole design of the program was to push people onto unemployment from the beginning, which is different from what other countries around the world did.
It's a perverse incentive.
It is a perverse incentive. It's a perverse incentive in the moment. It's also a perverse incentive when you do actually want the economy to ultimately recover, because we're seeing increasing numbers of permanent job losses. That means that it is going to be so much harder for us to get back to where we were. Not that that was that great of a place for a lot of Americans either before this pandemic hit. And so at the same time, you know, part of why I think this is all such a confused mess is because the president has either inserted himself in ways that have been unhelpful, like thrown a curveball, and suddenly it's like, let's do the payroll tax cut again, or he's completely absented himself from the discussion. Got a question on that yesterday. Let's take a listen to that.
Why are you not involved directly in negotiations with Capitol
I
Hill?
am. Oh, why? The fact that I'm not over there with Crazy Nancy? No, I'm totally involved. I'm totally involved. And we're going to be doing some things that are very good, because we don't think that look, what Chuck Schumer wants more than anybody, and I would say Nancy Pelosi would be second, they want to bail out cities and states that have done a bad job over a long period of time. Nothing to do with coronavirus or China virus or whatever you want to call it. They want to bail out cities and states. They want bailout money. They want $1 trillion in bailout money. And a lot of people don't want to do that.
This very passive approach is a lot different, I think, than what people thought they were voting for ultimately. They thought they were getting the deal maker, right?
Yeah. You know, I think it's reflective of the fact that, you know, Trump is an inflammatory element, to put it lightly, in these negotiations, especially for Nancy Pelosi. And so remember also that this is partly why he hired Mark Meadows, is that Mark Meadows sort of has actually decent relationships across the aisle in the House. He's known for his friendships with Democrats, known for, in negotiations like this, you know, being a reasonable element. So I think it might be Trump recognizing that and saying, you know, this is the generous interpretation of Trump recognizing that and saying, you know, Mark, you know, do what I hired you to do. And to be fair, too, Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi also seem to have a halfway decent relationship.
Well, so far it has not worked out very well, and it's, you know, Americans who are paying the price. Mass numbers, 30 million Americans who said they didn't have enough to eat in the last week. We also have 400,000 plus people just in the state of Michigan, renters who are facing potential eviction. The eviction moratorium is something else that has lapsed here. The federal eviction moratorium has also lapsed here. Nothing has been done to deal with that yet. And again, the lack of urgency, Pelosi now saying it, you know, this is going to drag on potentially weeks. They haven't come to agreement on any of the major pieces here, is just something that I cannot wrap my head around, while so many are needlessly suffering out there. But I'm going to tell you what's on my radar, and that's next.